Okie dokie. Hello, I'm Andre J, and welcome to Ask Me Anything About Video Signals. This is a new, regularly scheduled live talk I'll be doing, hopefully every month or maybe every 2 months or so. We'll see how things work out. And I will answer questions about video signals. You can ask me live here at the Polyphase Portal Big Blue Button server. For those of you over on the YouTube zones, there's a link I gave y'all that you can head over here. I'm just pretty much using YouTube to kind of help promote Polyphase Portal and this kind of stuff in general. I will only answer questions that are submitted either here live in the chat on the Polyphase Portal Big Blue Button thingy, or if you submit the questions to the email, and that should be in the description on the YouTube zones as well. So yeah, today for this first episode, I've got 2 questions that were submitted in advance. So I'm definitely going to make time to get to those, but what I wanted to do to start with, and this has been sort of a request from multiple folks, is just talk about video signals in general and try to talk about some of the more confusing things, what I think are the slightly more confusing things, and just probably spend about, I don't know, an unknown chunk of time rambling about video signals in order to give sort of a good, answer a lot of questions that people might have that they're not even sure about answering. All right. But yeah, Julian and Trevor, we will get to your questions before this. It'll be an hour max, probably, maybe a little bit less. And anybody else, if you ask questions in the chat here, if they're easy enough to get to, I will try to make sure I get to them this time or the next time for sure. All right, so I think from doing the classes that I've been leading, I think the thing that I've noticed that seems to get people the most kind of jacked up about video signals, trying to talk about video signals and explaining things, is that there's video signals, and that's one thing, and that's just an information. So the video signal is just sort of information, and it's represented either as continually varying analog information or discrete digital information. And then there's the actual cables and terminators themselves. And usually when we talk about cables, what we're actually talking about is the terminator. So I'm going to try not to talk about cables too much because all the cables are pretty much all coaxial cables. And when we think about terminators, we think about things like the yellow RCA cable, the yellow RCA terminator. You see how easy it is to slip back and forth on that? So yellow RCA, S-video, DVI, HDMI, these are terminators. And for a lot of the terminology we have, we use the same terminology for a terminator and the signal itself. And I think that's where a lot of things get kind of funky. So, what I'll try to do at the beginning here is I'll talk a little bit about the most common video signals that people will come across and use as video artists. And then maybe mention a couple of less common ones that you might bump into if you pick up some weird gear here and there, and then contrast that with the different terminators that you can see being used in them. So hopefully this will lay some nice groundwork for the any more of these that are going to follow. Okay. Someone's raising a hand. I don't really know what to do that, but hi, Brad. You can ask questions in the chat if you want. Okay, so first off, let's talk about CVBS video signals. So CVBS stands for Composite Video Broadcast, and then S, I forget, Signal Standard, something like that. So that is the most common sort of analog video signal most of us are familiar with. So when you say CVBS, and if you see gear that has an input and it says CVBS on it, usually what that means is that it has a switcher in it, and it's going to be able to handle both NTSC and PAL signals. and then possibly also Japanese NTSC, which has, I think, a different black level, and possibly CCAM, which is sort of the French alternative to PAL. Maybe Russia used it as well. I'm not sure. But so CVBS, composite video broadcast. So this was these refer to the standard broadcast signals that were used for when television television signals were sent out live via radio transmitters. And the composite refers to the fact that all of the information in the video signal is composited together into one signal. So to contrast that, let me just step aside and talk about what is a VGA signal. So the terminator for a VGA signal that we're most familiar with is called a D sub 15. It's the little blue thing. The D refers to the shape of the connector. It's keyed, so you can't plug it in the wrong way. And 15, there's 15 pins. And on a VGA signal, you can't broadcast a VGA signal. A VGA signal has to be plugged in on one side to the other. You have separate pins. You have separate wires, each of which transmit horizontal sync, that's X position, vertical sync, that is Y position of every pixel, and then red, green, and blue color information. They're all transmitted separately. If you're interested in learning more about VGA signals, there is a workshop that Tim Caldwell is hosting at Polyphase Portal later on this summer. You can sign up for it. That is all about experimenting with VGA signals on breadboards. So that should be pretty cool. But this is a non-composite video signal. This is a video signal where every bit of color information and geometry information is transmitted separately. But this kind of thing is very convenient because you don't get interference between the different things. You still can if you have a really poorly shielded cable, I guess. But what makes this different from a composite video is that composite video only has one cable you can send it on. It only gets transmitted in one continually varying radio wave. So that means that they had to figure out some sort of a way to put all of that information, the red, green, blue color information, and the horizontal and vertical sync, which is the X and Y information of where pixels go, into one signal. And I'm going to try not to get too mathy here. I think if there's actual demand for such a thing, I can get way more mathematical about things here and get some... draw some pictures and stuff and try to see what I can do in terms of going over the trigonometry of things and modulation stuffs. But I want to try to just talk about it as vaguely as possible but still give a good flavor for what's going on. So CVBS signals, this also refers to the fact that these have color information, red, green, and blue color, not just black and white. So let's talk about just a black and white color signal to start with because it's a little bit easier to talk about that. So when you had black and white broadcast video, all you needed was one continually varying wave that represented luminance, and that would be luminance per line. So what I mean by per line is that if we think about how how our camera is viewing things, we start up here in the corner and kind of draw over there that way. Think about that being as one continuous line of pixels, one continuous line of luminance information. So if we draw like that and say, okay, that's kind of dark, that's the plant right there. And then over here, that's whiter, that's darker, darker, whiter, 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 darker, and so on and so on. So we'd have this continually varying luminance information that would kind of look like this. And that's one single line of video right there, just black and white video. And you would have a whole series of those lines, hopefully enough of them that you could put them together on a television screen and view something that looks like a perceivable image. So that's just luminance information. That's just one dimension of color, not 3 dimensions of color, which is what you would need to have RGB. And then you would also have to have some information that tells you where is the X and the Y position of everything. So if you think about it, when we have this continually varying line thing, we kind of get a bit of the X information for free, because it's just going to kind of be constantly scanning from left to right. So all we really need is sort of one little kick to tell us where does the X start, and then the speed, the rate of the signal itself, and the rate of how the CRT works in displaying the signal will take care of the rest of it on its own. So the simplest way to do that is have like a little digital pulse. So there's no way that pulse is going to be interpreted as a continually varying signal, because it's got sharp edges. So you've got this pulse at a specific frequency and a specific amplitude, and that is your horizontal pulse. Everybody with me so far? So we get the rest of the geometry for free. We start with that pulse, and that puts us right up in the corner here-ish. This is so hard to do. Wow. So that puts us in the corner here. That's our horizontal pulse. And then we get around to the other side, and we need to have some sort of information that tells us how do we start over and draw another new line directly below the other, starting like right there. And that's done with just having another pulse, different frequency. And that's the vertical pulse. I'm fudging a lot of things here. Please feel free to correct me, or call me out, or do whatever if you want me to try to be more explicit about this, but I'm trying to do things fast and loose here. So that's our vertical pulse. That tells us where the Y position is. And you only kind of need one of those per line, because the line kind of gives you a lot of the information for free. The vertical pulse kicks you over to the next line, and then you draw another line of just black and white information. And if we're talking about an NTSC video signal, we do that 480 times, and you have 1 frame. Another thing to notice is that this horizontal pulse, the big one right at the beginning here that starts the up, that's also the pulse that tells you there's a new frame happening. So that's sort of the one that says start over completely at the top here. We have an entirely new frame to work with. I'm totally not going to talk about fields right now either. Fields are a thing, they are real, they exist, but we can talk about interlacing at some other point if people want to. Okay, so we have horizontal. Okay, so here's a quick question. Are these pulses for horizontal and vertical the sync pulses? Or is the sync pulse? Yes, these are sync pulse. So when we talk about H and V sync, we're talking about the same thing. These are just little digital wave. They're the little digital signals inside of the analog signal that are telling us when do we start a new line, when do we start a new frame. So we have, let's just stop and think about our signal that we have right now. So we have X position, Y position, and luminance information. So that's all we need to have a black and white video signal. So that's 3 things, and we can already see how we can fit these 3 things in a continually varying signal. So that's just one composite signal right there. Now let's think about for a second. So these signals, these kind of video signals existed for years and years and years until the technology advanced to the point where color video, color CRTs became a common enough consumer item that people were like, okay, we got to figure out how to make color broadcast. So the simplest way to do that, well, there'd be a couple ways to do that if you think about it for a second. So we thought about the entire video signal. I'm going to draw some more stuff here. So we have new frame, blah, 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 blah. Line, blah, 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 blah. So if you think about it, in a video signal, let's say this is an entire frame right here. We start here, and we've got a big pulse that says new frame. and then some continually varying luminance information, new line, continually varying luminance information, so on, so on, so on, 480 times. There's a little bit of space at the end here before a new frame pops out. So one way you might think you could be able to do that is you may say, oh, well, can I just add color at the end, and it could go back in and fill in the color. So for certain, if this was a totally digital situation, this could be possible. And there was, I think, various ways that different broadcast systems use this sort of extra space. Like I think in some parts of Europe, they had this weird little like back and forth you could do where you had like a little keyboard typed into your hooked into your TV set somehow, and then you could like get sort of like, it was a very sort of crude sort of like internet kind of thing where you could get like news, and it would just be text. That would be text information would be stuffed in here that would overlay the regular video signal. I might be completely hallucinating this, but I think I read about this somewhere that there was one of the uses they had for this little kind of gutter thing at the end there. So if we had a digital display, we could toss some color information at the end there and then hope that it just went fast enough that people would be okay with that. Unfortunately, we're working with the sort of, when working with the fixed electronic system of a CRT, you kind of have to deal with the fact that there's not a whole lot of slack time to have the cathode ray electron gun actually shoot another layer out, and there's not really any time to like recalculate or refigure out a video signal on the fly like that. Everything kind of has to happen simultaneous. So if we already have something like this, the easiest way to get more information on there is to use some kind of modulation. So we want to modulate this luminance and figure out a way that we can add enough color information onto that we can get a full RGB spectrum. And I guess that would be another good one, probably not to talk about now, but in the future would be talking about RGB, YUV, different color spaces and stuff like that, and how that relates to video signals. So we have luminance, and we want to get some more color information onto here. So let's just say, for the sake of conversation here, that we could encode all of the color information that we need in just one more continually varying signal and figure out how to just modulate that. So we'll call this one continuous color information signal C, or we can call it chrominance, and we want to figure out how do we get chrominance into our luminance. So there's a couple of different forms of modulation that we can use. There is ring modulation, there's amplitude modulation, there is phase modulation, and there's frequency modulation. So amplitude modulation, everyone is probably familiar with, at least slightly, because AM radio uses amplitude modulation to encode audio, the audio into, encode and decode audio into the radio signals. FM, everyone is familiar from it. Not from FM synthesizers, because basically zero FM synthesizers ever used frequency modulation synthesis, but FM radio did actually use FM frequency modulation in order to encode the audio into the radio waves. And then there's phase modulation, which is what every frequency modulation synthesizer pretty much ever used, except for maybe a handful of, like, if you use like modular synthesizers, you can do true FM. And if you've tried it out and you've done it that way, you can see why people didn't build entire DX7 style synthesizers around it. It's because you can't actually retain any of the original harmonic signal when you do FM. You can only retain harmonic information when you're doing phase modulation. And then there's a similar kind of thing with ring modulation and amplitude modulation. So ring modulation and amplitude modulation are both very similar, the same way that phase and frequency modulation are very similar. But if you do ring modulation, if you've ever played around with the ring mod pedal or ring mod effects, you notice that you end up sounding like a robot in a 1970s Doctor Who episode. You also notice that a lot of the frequency information sounds very garbled and very, very different from what it originally was. So ring modulation and frequency modulation are both have the property that they destroy the harmonic content, the original harmonic content of your carrier signal, which makes them difficult to use for certain purposes. So those are the 4 basic kinds of modulation that you could have. And what we use, well, I never used it myself personally. What they chose to use for the video signal was amplitude modulation. So just to go over what amplitude modulation is a little bit, let's say we have this little color information, and we want our color information to be a very different frequency than our, so that's C at the bottom here, chrominance, and this is luminance. So you can see I drew them kind of to scale here because we want to think about our color information. We want to have it be sort of very high frequency compared to luminance. That way we won't get that much distortion when we encode it into luminance. And we want it to not really like be that high of an amplitude compared to the luminance, so it also won't really like fuck up how the brightness works. So if you're familiar with how this works, you see that and you see that, and you'd end up by doing amplitude modulation on that, and you'd have this kind of like really kind of like, if you look far away, it doesn't look like you really have anything modulated in there. And you look at it closer and you can see the waves are kind of hairy. So the hairiness is that tiny little, the little waves at the bottom here, amplitude modulated onto there. So that's how you got the color information onto there. And I'm pretty sure that part is pretty similar in NTSC, PAL, and CCAM. And then the main difference between NTSC, PAL, and CCAM is the details of how that color information got actually encoded in there. PAL is phase alternating line, so there's something about the phase alternating every other line. CCAM, I totally forget. NTSC, I know a little bit more about. The big difference between NTSC and PAL is that PAL is encoding preserved the color information better at the expense of something else. I forget what the downside to the PAL was. And then NTSC, I think it was just slightly more like expensive components involved. And then NTSC's color encoding was a lot quicker and dirtier, and it was sort of set up so that it could go wrong. It probably would go wrong in a lot of ways when it was sent as a broadcast signal, but it was very easy to repair for an end user. So the signal, the color information could get very distorted as a result of storms, the signal going through like too many buildings, trees, bouncing off of water, some shit like that. But there was a pretty easy knob you could have on your television set that would just sort of twist and you could fix the color information. So it was kind of like saying, yeah, I know this is a bad job, but we can put a kludge right at the end that you can twist it back and fix it. That's what the phase, tint, or hue knobs on a lot of old televisions was. It was to fix. Well, actually, it wasn't even just to fix. If you go back far enough, you actually had to have a knob on there in order to decode the color at all. And I think that might be way too much of a digression to get into that part, but maybe later. How's everybody doing here? Everyone hanging with me so far? So that's our C. So you're gonna have to like take it from me on faith right now, and then submit a question in the future if you want to know more about chrominance. How did we get all of that color information? Because it seems like we would need to have 3 dimensions, and that's 3 different components in order to get to an RGB situation. Oh yeah, teletext. That's the one. All right, it actually exists. I'm not completely insane. Also, I'm here in my brother-in-law's studio. You can check out some of their paintings. They have the best Wi-Fi at the place I'm staying right now. Okay. So, more or less, I think that's the quick and dirty way to understand CVBS signal. So that's sort of the most common video signal, and the design of those signals was kind of built around the fact that they had to be broadcast. Broadcast meaning that originally most of these signals were just sent live. They were not recorded really. They weren't necessarily recorded anywhere. They were filmed live, sent directly onto the airwaves, and then watched live. That's what broadcast means. So technically video means that there's some sort of a tape, a magnetic tape involved. I think that's the origin of the term video. So video, broadcast, and film would be sort of three separate things. But for those of us nowadays, as video artists in the video art community, we tend to sort of like jumble together broadcast and video into like one realm. But if you look back, look at like magazines like Radical Software, people are writing about like the birth of like video art in like the 70s. The big thing for them was the fact that you could have videotape. There was Portapacks, there was the original like thick magnetic videotape that existed. This kind that you could actually, I think you could actually edit it just by chopping it. Not like the VHS helical scan thing where it's pretty much impossible to like splice by hand. Okay, so that is the CVBS signal. And I talked about the VGA signal. Let's talk a little bit about terminators involved for CVBS and VGA signals, the most common analog signals you'll ever find. There's one or two more, and they're kind of RGB, GRB signals. You will most likely never encounter these like in your life. You might find PVMs that take in SGB, GRB signals, and that's sync on green, and that's a GRB. That was a broadcast standard, only pretty much used in-house, where you would just have, it looked like component cables, which was the Betamax cables. They were called Betamax at the time, I believe. But instead of luminance being on green, it was actually green, blue, and red. It wasn't YPBPR. So terminators that are used for CVBS and VGA. Most common ones for CVBS would have been the F-type coaxial, and that's the older one you see on older CRTs. Just about every VCR would have them, and that's the one where you have the little wire and then a screw around it. That's called F-type coaxial. And that was always for a broadcast signal before it got demodulated from radio frequencies. So when you plug in on the back, you would see there's something that would say VHF, and then maybe something that would also say UHF. VHF was very high frequency. That's a specific band of radio frequencies. UHF is ultra high frequency. That's another higher band. The VHF was what all the broadcast stations would be on, and then UHF would be like public access stuff and sort of like the weirder, more like fly-by-night, lower range television stations. If you lived in the country, you probably never got a UHF. But cities would have some weird-ass shit on UHF. And then the cult film UHF by Weird Al is about, Weird Al Yankovic was about a bunch of oddballs who take over the local public access station. So F-type coaxial. Then there's the yellow RCA. And RCA is kind of one of those funny things because it comes from the Radio Corporation of America. This was a shell corporation set up by like the U.S. Navy way back in the day to patent troll radio and television stuffs because they were really concerned that too many foreigners like Italians and Serbians, these untrustworthy untrustworthy foreigners were getting all these patents on like radio shit. But there were laws against like the U.S. Navy actually like patenting these things, I think. So they set up this corporation, the RCA, which then took on a life of its own to make sure that like to try to squeeze out like the proprietariness of like radio and television stuff being developed. And now I don't think anybody remembers anything about RCA, the company, other than I have a really nice RCA camcorder I like, and we all talk about RCA cables all day, all night. So that's the yellow RCA. That's the one that just has a little plug, and those are what you would see on a lot of consumer video gear starting about mid to late 80s going up until today. You still see RCA cables on television all the way up to today. And then the other big cable terminator that you would use for CVBS is called BNC. And BNC is really confusing for a lot of people because BNC terminators were used for like just about everything you possibly could connect in a radio environment. So there's just like tons of shit out there that have BNC connectors. Just about every oscilloscope you get will have BNC connectors for like inputs, and if they have outputs, those as well. Test equipment, radio test equipment going like way back when will have BNC connectors on them. Networking stuff from the 80s and 90s used BNC terminators. So BNCs are all over the place. And you can find BNC cables all over the place too. But if you just dig through like a trash bin at like or dig through a bin at like a junk shop somewhere and just grab random BNC cables, it's kind of a crapshoot as to whether or not they'll work for video purposes because they don't all have the same resistance, I believe. You need to have 75 ohms in order to transmit video properly, and every so often you'll find yourself in a situation, I have found myself in a situation where I had a big trash bag of BNC cables and I'm just like plugging them into things and nothing really seems to work out well. The other confusing thing about BNC is that it was also used for SDI. So SDI became the broadcast, the in-house video broadcast standard, digital video standard once CVBS got sort of phased out. So I've noticed a lot of people have asked me over the years, oh, I got this video mixer, it only has SDI inputs. Oh shit, what do I do now? And then you look at it and you're like, no, it's an analog video mixer. It's just using a different terminator for things. So hence this entire thing I'm saying where I'm very confusingly and ramblingly trying to explain the difference about signals and terminators. And then we have VGA. VGA uses D sub 15, but everyone just calls that a VGA cable now, but it's a D sub 15 connector. And the reason it's important not to call that a VGA connector is that when we think about the other analog video signals, so you can take composite CVBS signals and then sort of like refine them in better ways. So S-video was, let's put the sync information and luminance on one channel and color information on another channel. So S-video, also known as YC, so you have Y, luminance, C, chrominance on different channels. And you could have component video, which was also known as beta, where you had Y luminance, and then you had PB and PR, which I'm not going to go into too much here, all on different cables. Luminance, sync information, PB, and PR, which they unhelpfully put into a green, red, and blue cable, even though what you have on the green cable is not green, what you have on the blue cable is not blue, and what you have on the red cable is not red information. Brad, this video will be archived on YouTube. I'll try to archive all of these on YouTube probably. But what this has to do with the D sub 15 is that you will find in a lot of video gear where they wanted to have a fuck ton of inputs and a fuck ton of outputs, that you would have this thing where it's just a D sub 15, and it would be an input or an output that could either be component, it could be composite, it could be S-video, it could be VGA, it could be HD component, it could be 1080i, 1080p component, something like that. And then you'd have in order to use that properly, you would have to have a D sub 15 cable that broke out into 5 BNCs. So this is on like Barco gear, I've seen this on Edirol gear. I'm pretty sure if you got a lot more video equipment from like late 90s through like the late 2000, almost to 2010, right about the death of the analog era, you will find a lot of these out there that just have a D sub 15 connector and then a breakout. Having a D sub 15 connector with the breakout thing is also nice if you want to do individual sort of like glitching on like the VGA signal, because it handily separates into different cables and different outputs without you having to chop up a thing and then like separate the wires yourself, the red, green, blue, H-sync, and V-sync. Okay, so that's analog video signals and analog video terminators. And then getting into the digital stuff, without going into too much detail about the actual signals themselves, the thing is that the digital signals aren't really, from a signal standpoint, they're not really that different from the two analog signals we talked about. We have the composite video, which is luminance and chrominance, YPBPR, and then we have VGA, which is an RGB signal. And you'll find that when you start digging into digital signals, they're all either some sort of YUV situation or something like YPBPR, except if it's digital, you always call it YCBCR, or you have an RGB situation. And you could have the everything be sort of sequentially composited, like in an SDI signal. SDI is one single cable, one piece of coax with the BNC terminators, and they can either be a big, chubby, fat BNC terminator, or the more modern ones have a tiny little, pretty little gold mini BNC terminator. And those just have one signal, one channel, and all of the information is transmitted very, very similar to how a composite video signal, except it just sort of sequentially has like, so it has like the H information, and then it has Y, which is luminance, and then CB, CR, CY, CB, CR. So it just kind of like spits out bits, and the bits, instead of having to do any sort of encoding and decoding, it just says, well, no, we'll just have luminance information, CB, CR, luminance information, CB, CR, except there's a bit more to it than that, but it's pretty much that simple. And you look at a lot of DVI signals. The DVI terminator, it doesn't really make sense to start talking about a DVI signal, really. It doesn't really make sense to talk about like an HDMI signal or a DisplayPort signal, because at this point we're kind of just talking about there's a big giant set of digital signals that overlaps a lot with the broadcast video standards, and it overlaps a lot with VGA and XGA. A lot of the signals you transmit on a DVI or an HDMI cable are basically just digitized versions of the same signal that was sent on a VGA cable. Well, actually, the VGA cable did actually have digital information on it to begin with. So, well, VGA signals were all generated digitally, but the VGA signal itself was analog. And then also, none of these signals are really either truly analog, because they're all discrete at some point or another. That's the other point where it gets kind of tricky to talk about analog video signals, because even the most analog of analog video signals still has a discrete number of lines. And then you could be sort of pedantic and say, well, from on a line basis, that is truly analog. It's continuously varying, and you can say, yes, it is continually varying, but because of the amplitude of the amplitude and the rate of the wave itself, there's only a certain amount of zooming in you can do until like it's virtually just a flat line. That has to do with, I believe, the Nyquist limit. And that's where you get the 720 in the 720 by 480 of an analog signal. So Scott asks, or Scott asks, what's the difference between analog and discrete? Analog is continuous and discrete is chunked. So if we think about, you can go way back. It has nothing to do with electricity at all. It has nothing to do with computers at all. Analog and discrete, you can go way back in history and look at different devices people have created and think about analog and discrete. An abacus is digital. An abacus is a discrete device for calculating things because you just have the little single stones and each stone represents 1 or 5 or 10 or 12 or whichever base you'd like to work on. And then analog would be something like, think about this. If you have a mill which is powered by a water wheel, the wheel itself to start with is analog. That's continuously turning. There's no sort of like chunks in the turning. You can have that wheel, and then your first analog to digital converter would be, you have your water wheel turning to power your mill, and then you have the like a rod going through that, a little axle going through that, and then the other side you have gears or a cam. So that's your first analog to digital converter, is taking a water wheel and then powering a cam off of that, or powering some sort of geared device. So analog and digital just means continuous versus discrete. But yeah, back to the digital stuff. So DVI, HDMI, DisplayPort, there's a lot of overlap with the VGA worlds. And it's honestly, it's a huge fucking nightmare if you ever try to like program things to be like, to work happily with like the full range of like digital video signals that exist out there. Because there's just so many of them. It's like, when you think about how the color space works, how the resolution works, how the fact that there's still, for some reason, support for interlacing, it's fucking crazy. And, you know, whenever you see someone say something like, I'm going to make a video device and it's going to support, you know, like 15 different analog and digital formats, you should probably say to yourself, I'm not sure if that device is going to be affordable or feasible anytime soon. And I was trying to do the gravity waves thing. I was just like, this is gonna be dope. It'll be able to support a bunch of different formats, I/O. And then like, when I finally like started like getting down to the nitty gritty of it, I was just like, no, fuck that, 720p. Stick with 720p output, and stick with just the most basic digital and analog inputs. Would be a really nice thing to like, if those things were a lot easier, but they're not. Okay, so I think we didn't really talk about the Terminators. Let's just talk a little bit about digital Terminators. So DVI was this kind of bastard hybrid of analog and digital. Nobody liked the cable, the Terminator at all, because it had all these tiny little keyed pins, and there was like 8 different variations. There was DVI. It would also carry audio on it. There was DVI that was just like, oh, it would have analog audio and digital video, or DVI that would have digital video. Kyle, that's a good question. I think I'll try to get to that on the next episode of this. You had this like horrifying array of like tiny little pins that would like, it took only the slightest amount of pressure to dislodge and make your cable completely worthless. And like 8 or 9 different actual signals that would be transmitted over it. The goal was to have something that was reverse compatible with the VGA signals that like graphics cards would generate, and then but also VGA couldn't support really high resolution shit. So, and DVI could. So I think you can go up to 2K on DVI. Not positive on that. But yeah, they really sucked. People found them really frustrating, and then everybody really questioned how frustrated they were with the DVI cables once HDMI came out, because it's definitely an easier thing to plug in and out. Yeah, HDMI, it's not really the Terminator's fault for a lot of things, but there is a lot of situations where you have HDMI has that issue of having a giant fucking jack and a giant fucking heavy cable hanging off of a really small digital device. And whenever you have that, the weight is just going to kind of like bend those tiny little pins, and then make your handshakes worthless. Digital signals, once you get into the consumer digital signals, you have to deal with EDID, which is handshakes. That's how do the digital signals negotiate? That's a back and forth, so it's a signal that goes back and forth from device to whatever's generating it, from projector to laptop, from your, I don't know, what else would you have? Like, I guess like a PlayStation and a flat screen. You have the EDID shit going back and forth. You have digital rights management bullshit going back and forth on pins, making sure that you're not recording your Blu-ray of some James Bond bullshit or whatever. And then there's DisplayPort, which I guess technically DisplayPort is different from HDMI and DVI, but then you strip down the signals and look at the information, you're like, is this really different? So that's probably a talk for itself. But SDI, DVI, HDMI, and DisplayPort would be the main terminators used for digital signals. And then you've got DVI comes in like 10 different flavors, SDI in 2 different flavors, the large BNC and the tiny BNC. HDMI, you can have regular size HDMI, mini and micro HDMI. And those, it seems like having those little like converter things is going to make things easier, but it kind of just makes it one more piece that's more likely to break sooner in the future. And then DisplayPort, you have the ones that the ones that just look like a thunderbolt or lightning bolt or whatever the heck it's called. And then you have the keyed ones, which I kind of like a little bit better than HDMI because they're asymmetrical and they have a little lock in them. So I personally really like cables that you plug into something and there's some sort of way you can lock it. Say the VGA, the D sub 15 is like, for me, the gold standard of plugging things in. That's probably also like aging me. That's dating me. Because I'm just like, oh, in my day, D sub 15 was so easy to use. It's not this fucking mini HDMI nightmare. But yeah, DisplayPort's kind of cool. But I think that is about enough of the juice of signals and terminators that's worth getting into tonight. So let me just quick answer the questions that we got through email earlier this month. So Trevor asks, 1, can you explain how to check a composite video signal with an oscilloscope? So Trevor, the first thing you probably want to do if you're really interested in working with viewing composite video signals on a scope is to get a waveform monitor. So a waveform monitor is a very specific kind of oscilloscope that is sort of built around being able to view a video signal, a composite video signal, and to like zoom into certain points and to be able to see it sort of like up to a certain standard of where should everything be. Is your black level correct? Is your color burst correct? So it's called a waveform monitor. You can oftentimes find vector scopes and waveform monitors in one little like a little rack mount thing together. That is my personal recommendation for doing it, because if you just pick up any old oscilloscope and then try to plug a video signal into that, you'll see something, but not every oscilloscope you find will have the right kind of, will have a high enough rate to be able to see everything properly. Can't remember what exactly, how fast. I think you want like 50 megahertz, 60 megahertz would be good if you have an oscilloscope to view all the details of like video signals well. But the waveform monitors are best, especially if you're just getting started. And you can even find like, I think like Blackmagic makes like digital ones that are like, you can find used for not too expensive. Or there's ones where you can just like plug it into your computer and view stuff too, so you just get a little like ADC adapter. So that's how I would recommend checking a composite video signal with the oscilloscope. And then I did a little bit of talk earlier today that I think could kind of help out in terms of like just like visualizing what does the composite video signal visually look like. Just let me know in a future email if that sort of like got enough of the flavor of what you were looking for down. And then 2, they ask, is there a way to manipulate a signal on an HDMI cable? So this is something which is kind of tricky. So, and there's a reason why we have, at Polyphase Portal right now, we have classes for doing like the sort of breadboarding analog video via composite CVBS signals and analog video via VGA, but we don't have anything via HDMI right now. And the reason is that, so analog signals, when you have a continually varying signal, what's built into it is a certain amount of resistance to like, or not resistance, but like flexibility in terms of like, you can really make it like really noisy. You can amplify it, you can pedestal it, you can, you know, fuck it up in a bunch of different ways, and it will still be recognizable as a signal, but the distortions will come through. So the analog signals, and most of them were sort of reverse built around this idea that you'd either be like sending it over the airwaves, or you could possibly be sending it over like 100 feet of like not necessarily amazingly shielded cables. So they were just kind of like, well, it's going to get noisy, but we want to make sure that at the very least, like some information is going to get through and it's going to be viewable at the end. So we want to just build some of this sort of like allowance for noise and distortion into it. But we don't have anything for HDMI because the reason that people started using digital signals in broadcast and telephone and communication, I mean, people were using digital signals before electronically transmitting them. Telegraph was digital, that was in ternary. Fire stations on the Roman frontier and like the Great Wall of China, smoke signals, these are all digital signals. When we think about using like sort of like digital pulses, the birth of that with like Bell Labs shit in like the 20s and 30s, I believe. The point of that is that if you have a continually varying signal like that and it gets kind of noisy, the noise is going to be sort of indistinguishable from a certain point from the continually varying bits. If you have pulses like that, you transmit those pulses, and there's a little bit of noise in there, you can see that continually varying, if you have all these kind of like little noisy variations in there, that will be identified as a part of the signal. If you just have digital pulses, the noise is ignored. It's going to say, well, this is pretty close to an on, this is pretty close to off. So the reason that digital information was used for transmitting signals is that it is resilient against noise in a way that analog is not. The problem, of course, the trade-off for that is that if your noise is larger, has a larger amplitude than your pulses, then you've completely lost all of your signal. So a digital signal, you get all or nothing. Whereas you have a really, really noisy signal, and I remember this from storms and our giant fucking antenna and living in the boonies when I was young. So say this is our signal, that little wave down there, and then whole bunch of noise on there, is you're going to have a tiny bit of the original signal in there. You'll still see and hear a little bit of the original television broadcast, but there'll be a fuck ton of noise. The color will be all distorted and will kind of like wash in and out. So an analog signal has resilience, but is very noisy. And a digital signal will have zero noise, zero distortion, but not so much resilience. So it's a lot harder to do glitchy kind of stuff on an HDMI signal with just the HDMI cable. Now, this is not saying that you can't do glitchy stuff with HDMI devices or digital devices, but the people who work with that, what you're doing is you have some sort of processing. You have some sort of like integrated circuit chips that are doing processing on the digital signal, and what you do is you put glitch points into the pins on that. So to the best of my knowledge, there's not that much you can do to like glitch up an HDMI signal just on the cable itself, because it's designed in such a way that it's either you're going to get a pretty good version of the signal or you're going to get nothing at all. But if you want to glitch digital signals and you have a device that is processing it, you can look at what like Lo-Fi Future is doing, and they're playing around with like a lot of these like converter boxes and making crazy fucking feedback stuff out of them, and like distorting like HDMI and DVI signals and shit like that. And what they're doing is fucking around with the circuits that are manipulating and processing the HDMI signal. So you have to kind of like feed it into something, find a nice place to like experiment with like tapping into the pins on an IC chip and experiment a little bit with that. So that's what you can do in order to manipulate HDMI signals. That's the best of what I know. And then we've got one more question. This is from Julian, and I think I see them here. So Julian says, when I connect the Edirol V4 into a Panasonic MX30, the signal is black and white, even with an S-video cable. If I plug the source directly into the MX30 or go directly out from the V4, it's in color. The MX30 handles signals that are much more unstable than the V4, even ones that cause blue screens on the V4. What is happening? So this is one of those things that these are questions that I'm just not going to be able to answer terribly well, because I'm afraid that this one falls under the realm of like all analog video devices have slight variations in the way they have degraded over time, and it's all going to make them play with each other in very specific ways. Now, let me just sort of like go through the list of things that I think might have something to do with it. Sometimes it could be an issue with like, I think some of the Roland gear, you can have it be PAL or NTSC. And if you have a PAL video device and you feed it into NTSC and vice versa, a lot of times, depending on how strong the device is at like working with the signal, it will just show a black and white signal. So there might be an issue with that, but it doesn't seem like that because you plug it into a TV and it's in color. Cables definitely seem like they're the easiest thing. Whenever I have an issue like that, I try to go with the easiest stuff to work with first. And this, because this also happens all the time, is I have cables and the ends of them get kind of frayed and fucked up and they just don't work that well. And if I'm using, especially whenever I'm using like BNC to RCA converters and vice versa, those don't always work that well either. So like 100% triple check all cables all the time and just fucking throw any cable away if it even seems slightly likely that it's like not doing the job right. If you're 100% positive on your cables and you're 100% positive on everything else, the other thing to think about is that what I've seen out there too in terms of people using Edirol V4s is a lot of people use off-market power supplies for them. The off-market power supplies seem to make them operate sometimes in unstable ways. You'll notice sometimes the like feedback on them is a little bit different, and maybe you power it on and it like does like this weird power cycle glitch thing for like a minute or two. So double check the power supply you're using. It may not be delivering quite the right juice that you need. And the final thing is just like, it just might be like that's how the V4 is failing a little bit. If you plug your V4 into a TV, the TV isn't a piece of broadcast video equipment, probably. So your TV is built to handle all kinds of shit-ass garbage signals. The Adderall V4 is also not up to broadcast standards either. It's not quite as strong or rigorous as the Panasonic gear is. Whereas an MX30, if you feed it a signal that is not up to broadcast standards, it's going to say no. If your color burst information is off, if the color modulation, if the chrominance information is a little bit off, and you see this a lot of times when people use those cheap $20, $30 analog HDMI to analog converters, which do not perform up to broadcast specs whatsoever, is you'll plug the signal into that and you'll see that it fudged the color information. It fucked up the color burst, or it fucked up the frequency of the color. And then it can't demodulate it, and it just treats it like a black and white signal. So unfortunately, it might be something like that. And you'll notice the same thing too, is if you plug it into like a CRT, it'll display fine because the CRT is okay with crap-ass signals. But the Panasonic gear is going to say, I live in a television studio, and I demand that all of my signals be 100% up to rigorous standards. So those are my best guesses as to what's going on. And I don't want this to come off the wrong way, but I can't really answer too many questions like this in the future, just because it's really just like grasping in the dark. And unless I read something that like it really jumps out to me that there's a really obvious thing, like if there's most of these things are just going to be some kind of like, there's just too much variation. It's like camcorders, CRTs, mixers. There's too much variation between the individual models, and there's too much variation within the individual model between like a CRT that was stored in my climate-controlled den for 30 years versus a CRT that I found out by the train tracks last month. There's just too many things going on and too many variables. But I hope that what I said here offers like a sort of good map for how to deal with these things. So I am starting to go a little hoarse, so that means it's time for me to wrap up. This was a pretty good time. Kyle, I will answer your question next time. And anyone else who is interested, I guess if we want to talk about oscilloscopes and video signals, maybe next time we can sort of focus on that. If anybody's got any more questions about scope stuff, video stuff, and the incredibly dangerous and potentially deadly act of opening up a CRT. All right, everyone, as usual, have fun, and I'll see you next time.